In this video, I'm going to show you 10 of the biggest mistakes new drone pilots make when they're starting out, including some tips that could literally save your drone. I've been flying drones for over 6 years and I've made a lot of mistakes in the process, from settings I didn't know that made me crash, to pushing the limits too far and nearly losing my drone. So hopefully this video will save you from making those mistakes and destroying your drone in the process. Mistake number 1 is not knowing the rules and regulations about drones. Now I know what you're probably thinking, here this guy goes about drone rules, and I get it. I don't really like drone rules more than the next guy, but please don't go flying next to an airport or over a wildfire and run into an airplane or fly in some kind of a restricted area, because you can get yourself into some really serious trouble and it ruins it for everyone else as well. Now, what these rules are is going to be different in every country, so do your own research, but here's some things that apply to most places. First of all, you don't want to fly close to airports or in restricted airspace. You can download apps that will show you where this is, and you also don't want to fly in places like national parks and wilderness areas, or near major sporting events or stadiums, or over emergency responses. And you're generally not supposed to fly over people, especially large groups of people that aren't involved in your drone flight. And you're not supposed to fly over 400 feet above ground level. Here in the US, it's going to be a pretty similar height in most other countries, and a whole bunch of other rules that again are going to depend on what country you're in. But just make sure that you do know what those rules are so that you don't get yourself in a whole bunch of hot water. And in most places, you're also going to need to get some kind of a drone license or register your drone. Here in the US, if you're just flying for fun, flying recreationally, unless your drone is under 249 grams, you're going to need to get the trust certificate. You can get it online, takes like half an hour and is free. Or if you're wanting to do anything more than that, want to make money with your drone, want to fly commercially, you're going to need to get your Part 107 license, which costs $175. It's a lot harder test. You actually have to go to a testing center to take the test, but it's definitely worth doing if you want to make money with your drone. And either way, whether you're just flying for fun or flying commercially, you'll also need to register your drone, which only costs like $5. And again, this is for the US. Most other countries are going to be similar, but this is obviously not a comprehensive list of drone rules, so make sure to do your own research. Drone mistake number 2 is not backing up the footage off of the SD card or internal storage of the drone. This is something a lot of beginners don't even think about, but if you crash or lose your drone and you haven't backed up the footage off the card, you'll lose all of that footage and won't be able to get it back. A friend of mine actually had their drone crash into a river with no way to recover it, and DJI actually replaced their drone, but they lost months of footage because they hadn't backed any of the footage up off the card, and so it was all gone when the drone crashed in the river. So always download the footage off of the drone onto your computer after a day of flying. Sometimes if I'm out flying and I'm worried that I might lose the drone, I'll actually just swap out SD cards between each flight, so I make sure that if I lose the drone, I won't lose any footage. Drone mistake number 3 is crashing when flying backwards or sideways. Now, this might seem obvious, but you can't see what's behind your drone when you're flying backwards, and same thing flying to the side, and so a lot of crashes happen when you're flying backwards or sideways. Now, you can get some of the best shots actually flying backwards or sideways, but you have to make sure that you think about what might be behind the drone or beside it. Now, obstacle avoidance definitely helps with this, but not all drones have it, and sometimes even with obstacle avoidance turned on, you can still run into things. So to prevent this, it's always a good idea to turn your drone around and look at what's behind the drone before flying backwards. And same thing if you're going to be flying to the side, turn your drone to the side, look what's over there before you go flying in that direction. And something else that can be really helpful for not running into things is the vision assist feature that a lot of newer drones like the Air 3, Air 3S, Mini 4 Pro, and Mavic series have, which basically lets you see out of the 360 obstacle avoidance cameras, so you can see to the side of the drone or to the back of the drone, and you can use that to be able to look behind your drone while the camera is pointed forward and you're flying and filming something backing up. So just always pay attention to what's around your drone on all sides when you're flying. If you'd like to learn how to get the most cinematic shots with your drone, you can check out my completely free 45-minute drone filmmaking training, where I share my top 10 secrets to getting cinematic shots, covering the best settings to use, how to compose your shots to get smooth movements, how to edit your videos, how to color grade them, and a whole lot more. And link to that is down in the description. Again, it's completely free. Now back to the drone mistakes. Drone mistake number 4 is losing orientation and not being able to figure out where your drone is. When you're flying a ways away, it can be really easy to lose your bearings and not know which way the drone is pointed. Now, if this happens, there's several things that you can do. First of all, you can pull up the map. This is down in the bottom left corner of the screen. If it's not showing the map, you can just swipe a few times until it brings up the map, and you can just look at that map. It will show the home point, where you took off, and where your drone is, what direction it's pointing, and you can see exactly which direction you need to fly it back home to you. Now, on a lot of newer drones, there's something really handy called AR home point, where it will superimpose a little home point on the camera feed, so you can just spin the drone around, look for that AR home point, and know which way to fly the drone home at any point. Of course, you can also just hit the return to home button and the drone will fly back all on its own, but it's good to also know how to get it back manually. Now, if none of these works and you have line of sight to your drone, which you're supposed to, there's a handy little trick that you can use to tell which way it's pointed relative to you. Just simply start flying forward and look at the drone and see if it moves right or left, and then just turn in the direction that it's flying. So if it's flying to the right, you'll want to turn to the right until it's no longer flying to the right, and then it'll be pointed straight towards you. And if it's flying to the left, you'll just turn to the left until again it's not moving, and again it'll be flying straight towards you. And if it's not flying either right or left, then it's either facing directly towards you or directly away from you. So you can just turn to the right, and if it goes to the right, you'll know it was facing away, and then you can just keep turning right until it stops going right or left, and then it's coming back at you. And if it goes left, you'll know that it was already coming towards you, and you can just turn it the other way to get it back on course. And that's just an easy way to visually regain orientation with the drone if for some reason, let's say your phone dies and you can't use all the nice automated features in the app. And this actually brings up reversed controls. When you're flying the drone towards you and visually looking at it, left and right are reversed. So if you're flying towards yourself, visually looking at the drone, and you push the stick to the right, the drone will appear to go to the left. If you push the stick to the left, the drone will appear to go to the right. And this can actually cause a lot of crashes because you push your stick one way, think the drone's going to go that way, and it actually goes the opposite direction. So just keep this in mind when you're flying towards you. Either just look at the screen and pilot it from the screen, or if you're visually looking at the drone, keep in mind that the controls are reversed. Eventually it just gets programmed into your brain and you don't even have to think about it. When I'm flying the drone toward me, my brain just automatically mirrors the controls and it's fine. But if you want to see how this works, just take your drone out to an open field, fly it towards yourself, and try to turn or fly to the left and right, and pretty soon you'll get used to it and won't have to worry about it. Drone mistake number 5 is running into power lines or cables. This causes so many crashes. I've nearly crashed my drone this way multiple times, and I have a lot of friends who have totally destroyed their drones by running into power lines. Power lines are very hard to see in the video feed of the drone, and obstacle avoidance a lot of times won't detect them, so it's super easy to run into them when you're flying. So when you're getting ready to fly, before you take off, always take a visual look around the area to see if there are any power lines or cables around that you could run into. And you can also take the drone up, spin it around, look and see if there is any power line infrastructure around. And especially if you're a beginner drone pilot, I recommend maybe not flying in areas with a bunch of power lines, because it just increases your chances of crashing by that much. And just in general, when you're out flying, keep a sharp eye out for any obstacles that your drone could run into, whether that be power lines or anything else. Drone mistake number 6 is keeping flying when your battery level gets too low, or flying with half discharged batteries. When you're flying your drone and get it battery level is low warning and the drone says it's time to fly home, it can be super tempting to try to just get in a few more shots before you land. And you can technically fly for a bit longer after the auto return to home pops up, but if you're a beginner, I strongly recommend that you don't try to do that, because at some point the battery will get so low that it will just start to auto land straight down wherever it is, and the only way you can keep it from auto landing is by pushing all the way up on the throttle, which will keep it in the air, but even then at some point it will just land anyway because it's run out of battery power into whatever is underneath it. And especially if the drone is quite a ways away from you, it can actually run out of battery power before you can fly it all the way back. I actually had this happen to me once. I was in Lake Bled in Slovenia. I was filming some shots with my Mini 3 Pro. I had it all the way out across the lake. I wanted to get a few more shots, so I ignored the low battery return to home, tried to get a few more shots, and then when I tried to come back, I didn't have enough juice in the battery to make it all the way back, and it just started auto landing, and I knew I couldn't get all the way back to my side of the lake. So instead of just letting it drop in the lake, I just brought it down and kind of have crash landed it in the grass halfway around the lake and then had to go run over and pull it out of the grass. Thankfully, I was able to save the drone, but it could have turned out so much worse. So definitely don't push your luck with low battery. Now, sometimes it is okay to fly with a battery that's partially discharged. Like for example, if you've just flown part of the battery and then want to do a second flight with it, that can be just fine. And this has gotten to be a lot less of an issue with newer drones with larger batteries like the Air 3 and Air 3S, but flying with partially discharged batteries can get you in some real trouble. The main times you'll run into issues is if your batteries have auto discharged. After a few days, they'll drain part of the power out of them because it's not good for lithium batteries to stay fully charged for a long time. So if they've auto discharged, or if you've half flown a battery and then left it sit for a few days, when you go to fly it again, it can actually limit the power output because the battery can't put out enough voltage to the motors, and that can make it so you can't climb with the drone as fast as you're expecting, and that can sometimes make it so that you'll actually run into an obstacle that you thought you could clear and get up and over, and in extreme cases it can even do a forced landing if the voltage drops too low. I've had that happen. It's not good, and it theoretically could cause a crash. So in general, try not to fly with batteries that have been sitting with a partial charge for a while, or if you do need to, just keep in mind that they may not be able to put out full power. Drone mistake number 7 is not realizing that you have obstacle avoidance turned off or that you're in sport mode. And this is something that's caused me to crash more than once. Slowly, and make sure that your movements stay nice. What? I just crashed. Like, I had obstacle avoidance turned on. Hold on a second. Oh no, obstacle avoidance was turned off. Don't trust obstacle avoidance when you have it turned off. It nearly caused me to crash quite a few more times, and there's a couple different ways that this can happen. First of all, in sport mode, if you haven't figured it out yet, there is no obstacle avoidance, and it's easy to just forget that you've flipped the drone into sport mode and be flying around thinking obstacle avoidance is protecting you when it actually isn't. And the second way it can happen, which might be even more dangerous, is if you turn off obstacle avoidance in the settings in normal mode, which I sometimes do to let me fly in tighter spaces. You need to make sure that you remember and turn it back on. This has definitely caused me some crashes because I thought obstacle avoidance was covering me, but it actually wasn't. This is super easy to do, so if you ever turn obstacle avoidance off, make sure you don't forget to go into the settings and turn it back on. And drone mistake number 8 is not knowing your drone's stopping distance. Now, drones can't just stop on a dime. They take a certain amount of distance to stop when they're flying. And the faster you're flying the drone, the longer it will take for it to stop. And this is super easy to miscalculate. It's especially likely to happen when you're bringing the drone back towards you, flying at yourself, or flying forward towards something. And in those cases, if you don't know exactly how long it takes the drone to stop, it's easy to almost crash into yourself or into other things. So just give yourself some extra stopping room, and it's a good idea to take your drone out into an open field where there's not a whole lot to run into and get a good idea of what its stopping distance is at different speeds. Drone mistake number 9 is not understanding how return to home works. Now, there's several important things you need to know about return to home. The first one is that when the drone decides to return to home, whether you just push the return to home button on the remote, or the battery gets low, or you fly out of signal range, it will ascend to a certain preset altitude that you can set in the settings and fly back to you. And you need to make sure that that altitude is set higher than any obstacles in the area, otherwise the drone could just smack right into them on its way back. I usually just keep this set to 400 feet because I live in an area with a lot of tall hills and obstacles, and I don't want to have to always be changing it depending on where I'm flying, but you just want to make sure that it's higher than any obstacles in the immediate area. Now, on newer drones, there is something called smart return to home, where the drone will use its sensors and flight data to find the most optimized path to come back to you without necessarily going up to the preset altitude. And from my testing, that actually works quite well. So on some of these newer drones, return to home altitude is slightly less important. But the next thing you need to understand is still very, very relevant even if you have the newest drone, and that is where your return to home point is set. A common misconception is that the home point automatically updates to wherever the controller is, but this isn't true. It actually is set to wherever the drone first gets a GPS log. So when you fire up your drone, it looks for and connects to a bunch of GPS satellites, and once it's connected to enough satellites to figure out where it is, you'll hear it say, the home point has been updated, and it now has set its home point to that location location, and that's where it will always fly back to when you hit return to home. And this is great most of the time, but there's a couple things that you need to be careful about. First of all, the drone will actually let you take off before it has a GPS lock, and will just use the vision sensors on the bottom to stay stable, which actually works pretty well. But if you fly a ways away from exactly where you took off before it gets a GPS lock, then it will set the home point where it got its first GPS lock. And if this happens to be over trees or over water or over somewhere where you can't get to, then when you hit return to home, the drone will return to that point instead of to where you took off, and you could potentially actually lose your drone. And the second thing that can happen is if you move away from where you took off with your drone, let's say if you take off from the back of a vehicle or from a boat on the water, and then you move away from where you took off, the drone will still go back to where you originally took off. And again, this could be really bad if you are a longer distance away, especially if you're out on the water. It could just go and hover and eventually land into the water. So to fix this, what you can do is you can actually update the home point. You just go into the settings menu, into safety settings, and you can update the home point to the current location of your remote so that it will come back to you instead of to where it took off. And the third thing you need to know about return to home is the signal lost return to home settings. By default, when the remote loses connection with the drone will automatically fly back to the home point, which is great 99% of the time. But sometimes that can be a problem. There's two specific situations where this can actually crash your drone. The first one is if you're flying under some type of overhead obstacles, for example, flying under tree branches or indoors. In situations like this, if the drone thinks that it's lost connection and return to home kicks in, the drone will fly straight up and run into whatever's above it. I actually learned this the hard way. I was filming at a waterfall under some trees, and I was actually standing just a couple feet away from the drone, but for some reason it decided that the remote had disconnected and initiated return to home, and it flew straight up into some trees that were above it, got stuck in the tree. I had to throw sticks at it, knock it out of the tree, fell down onto the rocks, and majorly damaged the drone. So big mistake there, and something you probably don't want to repeat. And the second time this can be a problem is, again, let's say if you're on a boat or a moving vehicle, you might not want the drone to go back to where it initially took off from or where the home point is if it loses connection, because that actually might be further away from you than where the drone currently is. So in both of these cases, we want the drone to just hover in place instead of flying back to the home point if it loses connection with the remote. So to change this, we can go again into settings, into safety settings, down to advanced safety settings, and there's three different options for signal lost. It can return to home. You'll want to keep it on this 99% of the time. It can hover, just hover in place, or it can descend and land. I don't even know why there's a descend and land option, because I don't want the drone to just land into whatever is under it. But for those situations where you're flying under overhead obstacles or flying from a moving vehicle, it's best to set signal loss to hover instead of return to home. But you'll just want to make sure that you set it back to return to home when you're done flying in those situations, because I've forgotten to do this and nearly lost my drone because I flew it just out of range, and because return to home was off, it wouldn't automatically return. Thankfully, I was able to go a little bit closer to it and get it to reconnect and fly it back. But you definitely want this set to return to home most of the time, and forgetting to set it back to return to home could make you lose your drone. And finally, coming into drone mistake number 10, which is trusting obstacle avoidance too much. Now, obstacle avoidance is absolutely great when it works, and it actually will save you a lot of the time, but it's not foolproof. A lot of beginners don't realize this. They don't realize that obstacle avoidance isn't 100% bulletproof. Obstacle avoidance works best with large objects like the side of a house or even a person, but it really struggles with really thin objects like thin branches in the winter or wires, etc. So you really need to pay attention to what is around the drone. I actually trust obstacle avoidance a lot more in the summer when there's leaves on the trees, because it can see them a lot better. In winter, I barely trust obstacle avoidance at all because I know there's a pretty high chance that it won't be able to see one of the twigs and crash right into it. So use obstacle avoidance to your advantage, but don't trust it too much and just think that you don't have to pay any attention to what's around your drone and end up crashing your drone because of that. And bonus mistake, mistake number 11, is getting boring drone shots. This is something a lot of beginner drone pilots do. They just kind of fly their drone around aimlessly and have no idea how to get good shots. So to fix that, you can click right here to watch another video where I teach you 10 cinematic drone moves that anyone can do, even if you're a beginner, that will make your footage look like it was shot by a pro. And make sure to watch my completely free 45-minute drone filmmaking training. And if you want to go even deeper, I have an entire 12-hour drone filmmaking course where I go into every single step of my workflow for creating professional drone videos. Subscribe if you want to see more like this, and we'll see you in the next video.